This is another blade from William Nease. It's his Canadian Machete prototype. It's actually a cut-down version of a much larger sword that he damaged through some destructive testing. This is actually the very first time I've used this knife, so I'm going relatively light with it for obvious reasons. The other thing, I'm taking it a bit more careful than I normally would because this is actually chisel ground. And chisel ground blades can easily turn in cuts because the forces on them are asymmetric. Now, over time, I'm actually going to even that out by grinding a bit on the side that has very little of the bevel, because I don't want a chisel ground machete. But until that happens, I'm just going to be experimenting with it, and again going a little light, and I'm playing around right here, mainly just trying to get a feel for the handle and how to maintain control on it. And those little tiny cuts are all done with the wrist, and you do a lot of movement, a lot of fast rotation of the wrist. So it's mainly me just playing around, trying to make sure I got a good, nice, firm grip on the handle, and I can maintain control and get the knife to go where I want it to. Cutting ability and penetration are decent with the knife. Cat-like reflexes there. It's very, very different than the solid because it's so much lighter and so much faster. So it's much more rotation, and much more of the power is coming from the wrist and forearm. It's pointless to put the shoulder or try to do any back or any kind of rotation with this. It just doesn't have the mass. There's nothing there to support you putting power into the cuts. So it's all about speed and rotation with this blade and getting it moving nice and fast. But again, this is the first time that I've used it, so I'm going relatively light. This is nowhere near the full cutting ability of this blade, and I never really go much beyond around 75% or so, even later on in the video, because again, just tooling around with it a bit here. So here's some alder, and this kind of stuff I do mainly for precision work, because of course since it's alder, it's natural wood, it's full of all little twists and turns and little branches that intersect, so I can aim for and hit extremely precise locations. So it's just basically a precision trial. So in all these places I'm aiming to cut exact places on the wood, and again I'm really focusing here not only on hitting the locations, but just paying attention to how the grip feels in hand and my ability to maintain control and movement of the knife, because that becomes really important later on when I start putting a lot more power into the cuts. These are just really, really light, and the tip has very low cutting ability because it's at such a leverage disadvantage. Any force on the tip will cause a very strong back rotation, very easy. So of course, as soon as I move a little bit back from the tip and just put a little bit of effort into it, it cleaves all this up. And again, these little speed trials are mainly what I'm doing here, is just really focusing in on how the grip feels in hand and making sure I don't get any slips, because that's critical. Like later on when I start putting heavy power into it, I don't want this grip to move in hand, so I need to be very, very comfortable with my ability to maintain control of it before I start doing anything serious. This was kind of funny. I thought this was a relatively solid piece of wood when I first picked it up. It became kind of obvious it's not. But that's one of the reasons why you need to be very careful when you're cutting natural woods, because these inner cores can be, you know, really, really soft, and you can over penetrate easily. This is some of the 2x3 that I was cleaving with the solid in one hit. So I'm getting about 50% or so penetration here, but again, this is rather light. Still decent performance, and the blade is decently fluid. I'm getting a bit more confident now in the movement of the blade, but you'll watch and you'll see that it will tend to skew in the cuts towards the right. That's again because of the chisel grind, and that's why I'm starting off, actually I'm cutting to my right side, and normally I'll cut towards my left, that's where I have more power, but I'm actually now cutting towards my right because again the chisel grind could make this scallop out, and if it scallops out I want it to go, of course, away from me and not towards me. That's relatively close now, more than 3/4 of the way through. I'm pretty sure I could cut a piece of this now in one hit with a decent amount of force put into it, but unfortunately I run out of it and don't get a chance to show it, but I came pretty close there. This was again some of the wood I was cutting relatively easy in one hit with the solid. A lot of cracks and splinters in this though, so you want to be a little bit more careful with it. Don't do stuff like that where I'm just banging the knife off the wood to get the scrap off it. If there is any wood still on the blade and you crack it off like that, it just produces a violent twisting around the edge of the knife. It's really not good for it. Nice smooth cuts. And this wood is really dirty too, so I'm going to have to sharpen this after I'm finished with it. Still decent, getting over halfway. I'm becoming rather confident now. Again, I can do this easily in one hit. Don't really do that at all. It's not good for it. That's where I'm taking the edge here now, because that could have easily... That's actually much worse on the edge than the actual chopping is. Moving back a little bit on the blade now to get a bit more power. I came pretty close. The tip is nice and fast and good for materials that can move out of the way, but you can't really bring a lot of power into the cut. Yeah, as I expected. One hit to get capable. These are some natural woods. That was pretty funny. It's again rotted all the way through, but didn't look like it on the outside, so pretty much anything would have cut that in one hit. This is pretty decent though. So this is starting to become a rather interesting blade to work with. It's fairly heavy if you compare it to, you know, say your 10-inch Bowie style blade, but it's a lot lighter than something massive like the solid, so it's interesting to work with it the day after working with the solid. It's a completely different muscle group. So the interesting thing about having a couple of knives like this is you could easily work with one in the morning and one in the afternoon, and they have very little overlap in terms of the muscle groups that they have. And it's a completely different technique, different style, so it's also nice to keep it a bit fresh. Again, really nice smooth cuts.
Okay. It's time to get serious. Let go.
So I'm starting to open up a little bit here now, and I'm probably at about 50% power now. I'm getting a bit comfortable. I like the handle. I got nice, good, secure grip on. I'm getting very little movement. I just want to check and make sure there's nothing in any of these, because some of these things can also have tacks and nails and stuff done into them. And this has been out for a while, so the bark could have grown over it. I could have got that with a better hit.
Didn't quite make the follow-through.
Now this is where, I mean, it's obvious that I'd take this blade over the solid. It's much lighter. Like, this has almost no fatigue whatsoever compared to the solid. For doing this type of work, the solid would be very difficult to use because trying to move it fast enough to cut through these small limbs would require a lot more effort. But they also wouldn't slow the blade down at all, so you'd have to accelerate it to get it moving, and then you'd have to stop it at the end of the cut. Whereas it's much easier to do both of these with the Prototype Machete. So this is effortless. Cutting ability is relatively high. Grip nice and secure. It's a traditional wrap, but it has a rather rough cord, so lots of retention on the grip. Now, the squared off tip profile is one of those sort of you either love it or you hate it type things. It has positives and negatives to it. You just sort of got to understand what's going on with it. A nice sort of tip with a big belly on it is nicer for doing sweeping cuts and is more durable in general. That secondary point on the tip, if you blast it into something, is much more likely to take damage. But again, it also gives you a secondary point that you can use to stick into wood, you can move it around, and you can do really precise cuts with it because again, it's a secondary point. So it's just a matter of knowing what you want in the knife. Now the solid would have had enough mass and inertia here to just blast right through all of these. But the Canadian Prototype Machete is lighter, and if I tried to do that, it could actually move in hand due to the movement of the wood. So I'm starting to get decently comfortable now, so I'm starting to ramp up, and most of these cuts are now between 50 and 75% power. So.
Where is this? Oh, I never heard that.
I always do a test cut rather light, just to see what the wood is like.
You know what that means.
Now we can get serious.
They say you can't solve every problem with violence. That may be true.
That's an interesting comparison. Using this and the solid, as they're so different in how they're actually used, which one I would actually prefer to do this work. And it's relatively close, but I think I'd actually like the solid for most of this work on the actual bench horse, chopping on that block. Because it's simply more fluid. When I make perfect cuts with this, it's great. But on cuts that are a little less than perfect, it takes a bit of effort to get it out of the wood, where the solid is not. And the other thing is, faster moving blades are inherently more dangerous because you have less control in the cut. The solid works with a much slower cut that's much more based on inertia and raw impact power. So generally, it's a bit safer for the way that I cut with it, but this is relatively nice for a knife of its class.
You can see when the wood starts to get splitting from the increased energy of the impacts, you start to see large scale fractures in it. So this is like a fracture wave. It's propagating ahead of the blade. It's tearing the wood apart.